And I want to talk about the concept of context and reality. This is a very important thing. There's a lot of broad things that are addressed. I'm around a great deal of people from different martial arts backgrounds. The people I'm around, of course, have a different perspective on what's effective and what isn't. For example, the hand-to-hand combative instructors believe that only freestyle, sparring-focused, goal-oriented, situation-specific training is required. When I say situation-specific, it means that you have to recreate the combat conditions, if it were, of the environment you're going to be fighting in. So what this means is that during force-on-force training, pretty much call it sparring if you want to use terms like paintball and laser tag as sparring. This is very much what the military does. They simulate the conditions of warfare by using Miles gear, which is lasers that set off a buzzing signal, which means you're dead. And these lasers are of course attached to the weapons of the soldiers who fire blank rounds, which gives you the same recoil and everything else as if you were in actual combat. More so when you're talking about things like smoke, pyrotechnics going off, being in the field for several days, running patrols and everything else, as if you were actually in that same environment conducting an operation that you were simulating doing. It makes it very specific. You develop a very specific skill set, and the reason for this is because when you find yourself in actual combat, you will fall back on what you remember. If for example, you're firing at little bullseye targets and you're doing so under a certain condition without your field gear and everything else on, it's very different from when you're in an actual situation firing at human-shaped targets. Well, that's an important thing to keep in perspective. Now, the same thing behind this is when you look at all the competition martial arts, the combat sports guys. A lot of stuff that the combatives guys train, but they don't train for with contact. The sports guys do train for contact. So they're, in some ways, you're a little bit ahead of the curve, because they're squaring up and everything else with each other and going against someone close to the same weight, close to equal skill levels. You might not find that in a combat situation. Of course, you might not be ambushed. Of course, you won't be ambushed in the ring either. Nor will you face a lifelike environment of facing asphalt or sand or wet grass or whatever. However, the sports guys do have one thing down right, and this is something that has to be addressed. They call it the concept of aliveness. Now, I take a different perspective on aliveness, because to me the only thing that is alive is actual combat. The actual conditions of combat sports is not alive. Not just because it's not alive doesn't mean it's not dead either. It's partially alive and mostly alive. What you run into is this. The combat sports guys and even the military combative guys both train based on the context of experience. Now see, the combat sports guys, the mixed martial artists, the kickboxers, everything else, they train through sparring and they also compete. And while I'm not really big on competition, I am very big on sparring. The flow, the tempo of sparring or competition or whatever changes rapidly with the situation. You have to adjust techniques based on a person's size, their speed, their amount of skill. Now, I'm not a big fan of running around in a gi or running around in tights or Speedos or whatever, because that's not realistic. Training in street clothes is an example of this. A lot of techniques that you're permitted to do in a ring, that you're able to do in a ring because of what you're wearing, you can't do on the street. Ground fighting takes a whole different perspective when you're doing it off of a mat and on asphalt or anything else like that. Now, but the problem is you still have to have experience at doing this. Now, while I agree with some of the traditional martial arts, and I like the ideas of katas as far as short forms go, as teaching you set patterns that you can recall on reflex. Well, a lot of people say, well, the set patterns is bad, and to an extent it is. However, even Bruce Lee, towards his the latter part of his life, and he was extremely young at the time as well, started paying a lot of attention to forms, which he had dismissed earlier, because the thing about forms is a lot of times forms teach you to chain techniques. And look at it like this: you're in a fight with someone, you're in a tight space, or even if you're fighting stand-up, and for whatever reason you hit them, and the same amount of energy and everything else you're putting into that hit, they're still on their feet. Is it so hard to believe that you can that you have to go back into a rechambered position to hit, or you just hit and fall in? Well, the same thing applies. You have to be able to learn to adapt and change your technique through learning responses through experience. Now, the problem is this: a lot of people lack experience, and certain people try to rationalize the idea of lacking experience by saying, oh, I don't have to compete. Well, no, you don't have to compete, but you do. You should spar. Forms are all nice, they're pretty and everything, but they're ballet. They're rehearsed. You're not hitting anything, you're not being hit. So, in context of that, you're not learning to take a punch, you're not learning to give a punch, you're not learning to adjust for an actual moving target, or someone with a little bit of skill, even someone with no skill. And while I'm completely against the idea that a lot of sportsmen and combat martial arts put out of the untrained attacker, because everybody trains. They might not train formally, but everyone trains to an extent. So what you're looking at is someone has experience in one way, and they might adapt it or change it to another. I know a lot of guys who did, for example, I don't know, say maybe 1 to 3 months of Greco-Roman wrestling in high school, or high school wrestling, folk wrestling, or whatever. Then they went and took karate, but they couldn't afford to pay for the lessons. They made it up to yellow belt, or just a white belt. And then they went and studied boxing for a couple of weeks and learned all the little techniques they could from that. And then took those 3 little things, went together, sat in their garage and beat up on their brothers and their cousins, and fighting their old drunk dad and everything. And took what little bit they learned from those 3 things and kind of fused them all together, and then sat down with books and picked up a bunch of other stuff. And they learned it and practiced it by beating up on other people. These are your schoolyard bullies, your local neighborhood toughs and everything. Now, what happens is these people have experience. The whole idea of the military simulating combat conditions is to give you simulated experience that you will fall back on in times of stress. The whole purpose of sportsmen and combat sportsmen sparring is to fall back on, give you some experience to fall back on. Now, this is very different from when you're actually talking about real life conditions and the world around you, such as talking about being an actual confrontation on the street. And the thing about this is, you can rationalize it however you want, saying, I don't have to compete to prove this, I don't have to spar to prove this. But the problem is, if you lack experience, you can't come in with academic knowledge and say, I'm an expert. We used to have a joke in the Army that if you did something one time, you was an expert.